Carbon and molecular diversity. We'll go with sections 3.1 and 3.2. And really the purpose of these two sections is to lay out the importance of carbon. The importance of carbon. And anything that contains carbon is organic. And all life is organic, so all life must contain carbon. In addition, when we're looking at our biochemistry unit here, not only will we be looking at carbon, but some of the other extremely important biological elements as well. Almost all life contains hydrogen. And hydrogen is very important, and most carbon compounds will be saturated or nearly saturated with carbon. Other important organic molecules are oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, to some extent, and nitrogen. And these are really the big six right here. These are really the big six: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen, as far as what makes up biomolecules or large macromolecules. There are some others like sodium, calcium, potassium, iron, that are really important in your body. These first three as intracellular ions. And iron, of course, in blood and your hemoglobin. But really, these six are the main important ones for the macromolecules in your body. And what are the macromolecules? So macromolecules, I'll just write it down here. Are the biggest molecules that are in your body. They're composed of many little monomers, little parts, and they make up or are the building blocks of all life. So really, when we're talking about macromolecules, those are lipids, and usually lipids aren't considered macromolecules because they're the smallest, but for this class we'll consider them macromolecules. Carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. Alright. So those are the four things that are basically the foundation and the building block for all of life. Alright? So that is kind of a little bit of an intro to this unit right there. So why is carbon important? And why do we care so much about carbon? Because it forms the basis of all life. So what's really interesting and really important about carbon is that it can form bonds with all of these other elements. And if you remember your chemistry, that's because of its electron configuration. So if I have a carbon atom right here, and inside its first shell, because we know it has 6 electrons, it has 2 electrons here in its first shell. In its valence shell, it's going to have 4 electrons. And that's really important. Why is that important? It's important because it can accept 4 electrons. So it can bind with other elements to get a perfect octet. So 4 hydrogens could be bound on here. It could form a double bond with 2 oxygens, like in CO2. So we could get CH4, we get CO2. It can bind with any of these, or are nitrogen, sulfur, oxygen, phosphorus. So what's really important about carbon is it can single and double bond with lots of stuff, with lots of elements. That is one reason why it's so important in biochemistry, and why it's the forms the basis of all life, because it can bind with a lot of things. And another reason that it's extremely important is carbon is kind of medium electronegativity. And why is that important? Here, let me just scroll this down a little bit. Why is that important? Well, that's important because it can be both a oxidizing agent and a reducing agent. So, for example, if I have carbon right here, and then on the other side I have a hydrogen, and we're going to have this bond here in between them, carbon is more electronegative than hydrogen. So the electrons would find themselves clustered closer to the carbon over here than the hydrogen. In that case, it is being reduced. It's pulling these electrons towards it. And in a lot of biochemistry, these hydrogens can be removed by strongly electronegative elements like oxygen in water and things like that, and we get important biochemical reactions. On the other end of the table, when we have a carbon atom, let's just get our red out there, bound to maybe an OH or a hydroxyl group, it is oxidized. Carbon loses electrons because oxygen is much more electronegative. So the electrons are being pulled over to the O and the OH group. And in this way, this OH group becomes very reactive in like carbohydrates, and that's part of why carbohydrates are metabolized, is the oxidation of carbon. So oxidation, very important. All right. A third reason why carbon is responsible for a lot of the diversity that we see in biological molecules is because carbon can form many branched compounds. So, for example, if we have 4 carbons or five carbons in a row here, and so I don't draw them in, we're just going to pretend hydrogens are on the end of each of these bonds I'm drawing right here. Carbon can form this compound with 5 hydrogens. It could form compound like this, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It could then form a compound with double bonds, and this is all just carbons and hydrogens. And this double bond could be somewhere else. And it can form rings, so ring structures. like that in cyclohexane, or if we add some double bonds in benzene. So its ability to form very many different structures with just the same components, carbon and hydrogen, make it possible to create all these diverse compounds. And oh, by the way, these compounds consisting mainly of carbon and hydrogen are called hydrocarbons. And they're very important because they are the basis of our petroleum products. Now, one of the things that's really important in our biochemistry isn't just this carbon and hydrogen backbone, so not just a carbon attached to a lot of hydrogens, but when our other groups get in there, when we add sulfurs or phosphorus or oxygens, and when you have a long backbone of carbons just attached to hydrogens, and then you have another attachment like right here that maybe has an OH group or SH or something sticking on them. This is called a functional group. And they're very important because they're usually the sites of reactions, so biochemical reactions, which are going to combine these biochemical compounds and also maybe break them apart in your body to do the many different things that they need to do. So not only are they sites of the reaction, but they also change the shape of the compound. So if we have a compound maybe like a globular enzyme, and it has a large functional group right here, I'll just put like FG, that's going to change the shape of this compound and change what it's able to interact with, and maybe where a binding site for a protein would go or something like that. So functional groups are very important, and there's 7 main functional groups. And I would see your book for those. You don't need to memorize, so no memorize. But some ones you should be familiar with, or you will be familiar with, is our hydroxyl group by the end here, our amine group. You'll definitely end up being familiar with phosphate group here. And as far as the next, your carboxyl group will be important, because all of these are found in very important biological molecules that we're going to be talking about. For example, an example of a functional group and how they're important is in ATP. So the energy currency of our cells. There is 3 organic or phosphate groups that's attached to adenosine, and the catalytic removal, or the removal of a phosphate from ATP through ADP to ADP, creates energy in our cells. And so the chemistry here of this functional group, phosphate group, creates this energy, and that's why it's extremely important in our biochemistry. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is building macromolecules from monomers. So macromolecules are all polymers, which means they're built up of smaller pieces. So we might have a piece like this, connected to a piece like that, just a repeating chain of smaller pieces. And a single piece is a monomer, and the whole thing put together is our polymer. And all of our macromolecules our polymers are composed of those monomers. And there's a uniform way that they are built. So building macromolecules. So those different pieces are assembled or put together by a special reaction, and it's called dehydration synthesis. And dehydration, like if you're dehydrated, you don't have enough water, dehydration is the removal of water, and synthesis, to build. So in dehydration synthesis, we're going to remove water from two unattached chains of monomers. We have an OH group at the end of one, a hydroxyl group, a hydrogen, and we're going to remove that and make water and join these two groups up. Alright? So that is how the macromolecules, those polymers, are made. That's how lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, that's how that works. On the other hand, we can break those apart, saying maybe we want to digest carbohydrates to get some energy in our body. We can break up a long chain by doing the opposite, by adding water, called a hydrolysis reaction. So we're going to add water, and then we're going to just get two separate chains, one ending with a hydroxyl group and one ending with a hydrogen. And that is how we break apart macromolecules, and how your body does that in metabolism and things like that. So, that's kind of it for this first section, kind of brief. The importance of carbon, and an intro here to biochemistry. If you have any questions, ask me, and I will talk to you again in class.